welcome the opportunity to speak on this, and like with the Sovereign Fund, I've done my best to understand it, and it's difficult to not come in from a financial background. And so I look at it and we see there are 141 sections and 9 parts, or 79 parts, I've forgotten. I've really tried my best, Minister. So let's look at what you're telling us. You're telling us that there are twin goals in and I acknowledge the work that's gone in the department. So let's start with what you're telling us. The twin goals of this automatic enrolment system, where people don't have a choice in the first 6 months. So let's get that out. There's no choice, and they're going to be automatically enrolled. And the twin goals are to create the same sense of imperative around savings for retirement, and to help those on lower to middle incomes to accumulate retirement funds. So they're the twin goals, and we recognise that the Citizens' Assembly, 87% of them agreeing that there should be some form of mandatory pension scheme. And then, of course, from a market consumer demand, the ESRI research indicates that over the longer term, this automatic enrolment will be good for the economy, as retired people will spend more. So we're in here now to designating people as consumers with very little else. So what we're talking about is a state-sponsored, now it's important, sponsored, because Deputy OD made important points, but I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding. But again, I'm no expert. So what we're talking about here is a state-sponsored supplementary retirement savings schemes into which employees will be automatically enrolled. State-sponsored. This is not a state scheme. So you might correct me if I'm wrong. This is not a state scheme. This is not a state fund. And therein lies the nub of what we're talking about when we come to talk about where that money should be invested, whether it shouldn't be, make sure it's not invested in the arms industry or the fossil industry. And from what I've read in the documents, and again I want to thank the library and indeed your own department for the clarity of what they produced going back. The essence here is this is not a national fund, not like the Sovereign Fund, not a government fund. And so therefore we're sort of selling it as if it is, and yet we're saying, well, we don't really have much control over that fund when it comes to the investment in arms industries or fossil fuel industries, although we're putting in some protections with the environmental, the social and the governance that will have to be oblige the investors to take into account environmental, social and governance issues, but only oblige them to give due consideration. Now, I have a huge difficulty with that, and I understand the committee made strong recommendations in relation to that, no arms industry, and in fossil fuel industry, and also in ensuring that the bulk, or certainly a substantial amount, was invested in Ireland. And again, the answer coming back from all the documents I have read is that we can't really influence that in any way, because it's not a national fund, it's not a government scheme, so we want it every way, Minister, is what I read. And I emphasise throughout all of this, I'm no expert. And if I've taken the trouble to read it, and I'm having difficulties, you can imagine at the end what an I don't mean ordinary, but a busy mother, father, trying to decide between investment funds and what they're going to do with the money that they have saved over a long period. So I'll stick with what where it's a state-sponsored supplementary. The automatic enrolment will be operated on the basis of a pre-funded defined contribution model. And then we're told with members holding individual retirement savings account. And of course, the individual have freedom to choose a savings fund. Now, there's not much freedom here when I come around in a circle. They can opt out, which is good at different points and different windows of opportunity to opt out or to suspend. And the whole purpose of this is to deliver a pension fund on maturity that individuals can draw down. But at that point, Minister, they're drawn down, and they'll have to make decisions to reinvest it in various products with a limited number of investors, I might add, because that's what's going to happen in relation to the Central Processing Authority will tender to a limited number of people. And the poor, the confused father, mother, man, woman will have to make a decision which funds. Now, we're told that we're an outlier, that all other countries have done this. Some have, yes, in New Zealand, England, and so on. But in telling us that New Zealand is particularly different because they match the funding with 50% funding, and they allow the people to draw down their investments completely if they want to buy a house, for example, which is not allowed here. So New Zealand is particularly different and worth looking at. Then we look at England, but we're not told about the opt-out rates. It'd be great if we had the opt-out rates somewhere in relation to it, because when I come to a different structural basis for auto-enrolment from an expert that wrote to the Pensions Council, and thank you, Minister, you ensured that a report was carried out. One of the criticisms of his suggestion is that we need sort of maximum participation at all times. And that applies to this scheme as well. We need maximum participation for the scheme to work, to have maximum funds in it. So I want to know the opt-out rate on these other schemes. And then there's the digital part. And again, it's a digital by design, which is welcome in the modern world that we're living in, but there must always be provision for those who are not digital. Now, I read that in different places that has been accounted for, but again, if you could confirm that when you're summing up. Of course, the essential features is it's going to be phased in. So employees and employers will be paying 1.5% in the initial compulsory period, and over 10 years then it will rise to 6%. The employer and the employee be paying the exact same contribution, and the government then paying slightly less. So by the time we come up to the 14% after 10 years, every single employee that remains in the system will be paying 6%. 14% is the total. 6% for the employer, 6% for the employee, and 2% from the state. Now, just on the businesses alone, paying that up to a maximum of 80,000, I think. I just took the trouble of looking at what the restaurants have produced and telling us the trouble that the restaurants are in, which colossal, very, very serious trouble in relation to the number of, I've lost it somewhere. Here it is, the Restaurant Association. Jim Power, who I don't normally quote in the Dáil, but he's setting out in black and white the difficulties that small businesses are experiencing. And on top of that, there's going to be an obligation now to match the employee's contribution, albeit over a 10-year period. But the actual figure for a person, a man or a woman, on a salary of 35,000 a year, they'll be paying 40 euros a week, weekly. Again, if I'm wrong, correct me, 40 euros a week out of they're assessed on their gross salary, 35,000, and they're paying 40 euros a week. Now, to me, that's colossal. That is colossal, because when I look at all of this, I'm told that the coverage for pensions in the country is particularly bad, as low as 35% in the private sphere. And when the research tells us people didn't get around to it, but more importantly, 40% can't afford it. They simply cannot afford to pay into a pension scheme. So I have serious difficulty with that. Then there's no tax relief. And again, I read carefully why. And we're keeping, because you're matching the funding, and some people on the lower money wouldn't benefit from the tax relief in any event. But what we're doing is keeping the distinction between those who have a lot of money and can afford to invest and get a huge tax relief, as opposed to the lower income groups. On a structural basis, we're going to set up a central processing authority, and it'll be responsible for the operation, the coordination, the supervision, and the development of the system. In a 30-year period, that processing authority is going to cost us 250 million. That processing authority, I take all these figures from the regulatory impact assessment, 250 million, and there'll be 60 people employed. It'll be set up on an administrative basis first, before the legislation comes in. We're told that this is all necessary, and because then it will be in a position to implement economies of scale. They'll collect the contributions, they will tender out for investment managers, and they will invest the money. Now, I couldn't possibly comment sort of on the investment part of this, but I do know that we've learned nothing if we continue down the road of investing and investing in the manner that has led to the crash in the first place, without learning from COVID and without learning from a climate emergency where transformative action is needed. So I leave aside my doubts first about taking this much money from an individual when they can't afford it, investing it with no guarantees of what the returns are, because in all of that literature I could not see. I was told about a fund of 250 million or so, but I have no idea what the person will get after saving that money over their lifetime, what they'll get back. And you have reassured us in this speech and in this documentation that there are 3 pillars, and pillar 1 remains the bedrock, that the pension system, the state pension in both its forms, remains the bedrock. However, I have great concern that that's not what will happen, and that once people are paying into this, that it will be used to reduce the state pension. I have serious concerns about that. You and I will be well gone out of here, and we might be active in another life somewhere, but we were well gone. So I am very, very concerned about that. In relation to the regulatory impact assessment, a number of things jump out at me. They agree, in a sense, and I'm paraphrasing them, that it will be very difficult for people to make that type of contribution, given the low salary of 35,040 euros. However, in the long term, we're told it'll be good for them. Now, I'm not happy with that reassurance in the long term. Taking 40 euros a week, but it'll be good for them in the long term. If the state pension at the moment it needs supplementary, which is the whole purpose you're telling us of this, not to reduce the pension, but to supplement it. If that's the case, why now, when we're putting money into sovereign funds, are we not committed to raising the pension to allow people to live with dignity now, in the present time, as opposed to sometime in the future, depending on the returns from funds? That does not make sense to me. And then, if we look at the effect of this on women, just to go back to my point there, the ESRI concludes that some individuals, particularly those on lower incomes, may struggle during the initial mandatory 6 months participation in the scheme and so on, but long term they'll improve. But it goes on to look on women and the disproportionate effect on women. So, men and women have different experiences of employment in terms of employment rates. So we have the prevalence of part-time work, the extent to which men and women differ in caring commitments, and so they're in and out of the market, they're lower, but they do more part-time, and so they're going to be worse off. They also women have differing levels of longevity, which will impact on the benefit of auto-enrolment in the long term. And lastly, women tend to be more risk adverse than men, more risk adverse, and I think that's a very good quality, in the allocation of their financial assets, and are less likely to choose the higher risk, higher return option, and so on. So for all those reasons, women are going to be affected, poorer people are going to be affected, and the vague thing in relation to the environment, social and governance, do not cut it with me, Minister. Maybe it might have cut it with me years ago, but not after a declaration of emergency, and not after COVID, when we need transformative action. So bringing this in with government stamp, while at the same time saying it's not a national fund and we have no control over it, is extremely worrying. Then, just finally, in my last 5 minutes, I want to go to the man who I don't know, but I have met, and I've read all his stuff, and he's met some TDs, and he's written to the Pension Council. And I think that man deserved his submission deserved not respect, but greater analysis than what's happened. We had to table questions to get the report by Fitzgerald, the one you commissioned, Minister, or your department, in relation to this man's submission. And he wasn't making the same arguments as I am here today, but what he was saying was there's a safer way to invest this money. And after 10 years, I understand there'll be, is it 31 million or 21 million in the pot alone? And he came forward with a suggestion or a proposal that there was a better way to invest this that would give double the return with less costs. And I'm not sure why that wasn't given more attention. So he's written to us and he says, the Pension Council's February letter to you, Minister, was extremely unbalanced. It didn't mention that the independent expert appointed by the Council concluded that workers' pensions under his proposal would more than double those under the government's proposal. And he's asked, was that not relevant? He also points out neither did the letter from the Council to you, Minister, neither did the letter mention that pension accounts would look like high-interest deposit accounts. So I'll read that properly. The letter, his proposal, members' pensions accounts would look like high-interest deposit accounts with minimal risk of negative interest rates at the time, and so on. And he goes on to point out the volatility of the UK's Nest scheme and the volatility that that's experiencing due to the high dropout rate. Now, this is a man who won the prestigious Frank Reddington Prize competition, an actuary with many, many qualifications. And he came forward in good grace, and I wouldn't insult him by misquoting his figures or attempting to misquote him. But I can read and I can understand. And what he's come forward with, which I'm not even sure I agree with, but he's come forward to say this is a better way to safeguard the money, better returns, and gives reasons for that. And the independent report, as I understand it, which I've also read, also says and agrees with him it will give double the returns amongst other advantages. Clearly, problems were highlighted in terms of post-retirement investment and in terms of a buffer account. I have no idea why the Pensions Council didn't engage with them. Let me put that in a fairer manner. That's this person's understanding, that the Pension Council did not engage with him, did not give him a chance to come back and give his reasons and also deal with the criticisms. So here I am now looking at this pension, and on the face of it, very good idea to have savings, very good idea that we would encourage people to save. But savings are a completely different category of financial, of money, than money going off into a central authority who will then tender and have a small number of investors who will then go off, albeit on different risks, moderate, less moderate, and a default. I think there are 4 categories of risk. Now, how can I or any person on the ground understand that without trust? And my trust is gone when I see the explanations telling me that this is not a national fund, that this is not a government. I would have a lot more trust if this was a government initiative with a government guarantee and an actual acknowledgement that savings are important, but they belong to the person and they come back. And the only reason I understand that it's not compulsory as in other countries is, thanks be to God, we have a constitution, and that a constitution protects, although I give out on occasions, it protects the property rights of the individual. In this case, it prevented a compulsory system, and that's why it's the opt-out and the suspension and all of that is allowed. So while I would like to support this, Minister, I find myself really in a very difficult spot. I'm around long enough not to trust institutions, and I've never seen them learn proactively, actually. I would have thought we might have learned proactively from the financial crash, but we don't seem to have. So I would really like at this stage, if the person who made that submission, who has won awards and prizes, was given the dignity and respect that he deserved from the Pension Council. If I'm wrong, I'll say sorry. And an opportunity to say and back up why his system is better, given that the independent report backed what he said, albeit with certain criticisms. There are